Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Yasmina Greco. I'm with O'Reilly Media, and I'll be your host for today's event. Folks, we have quite the lineup for you all, and we're going to talk to you about putting your Apple Healthkit or Fitbit health data to work. As we get the event started, I just want to cover a little bit of housekeeping with you all, and then we'll get the program going. Folks, you can ask questions at any time. You have a group chat widget at the very bottom of your screen. It says group chat. Open that. You can type in your comments and questions and send them in, and we'll take as many as we have time for towards the end of the program. If you have any trouble with the event today, please try refreshing your web browser. And also, you will have streaming audio as we get the event going here. And folks, at this time, I'd like to turn the program over to Roger Magoulas, your moderator. Hi, Roger.
Hi. I too would like to welcome everyone, and we're going to start the video portion of the webinar. So welcome, and we also look forward to your questions.
Welcome. We're here at the Sebastopol Studios to talk about a project I recently worked on for Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. I'm here with the whole team. The project was called Operationalizing Health Data, Putting Data to Work. And it was really pretty an interesting process because we learned a lot. And what we'd like to do today is share some of what we learned. And to give some insights for anyone who might be thinking about health as a field to get into, or to work in a software or technology way different than what's been done in health before. We think that what we ran into, the things we learned, ended up being really instructive for anyone trying to take that next step. So we're here with a great crew. First we have Tuhin Sinha. Tuhin started off on the project as the technical project manager for something called eHeart, which was a very large Framingham-style heart study. And Tuhin comes from a computer vision background, so he's plenty geeky for this subject. Then we've got Rob Rustad, and Rob has a long history with startups, went into health and has done some project management and marketing in those areas. And then we've got Ian Eslick, and Ian comes from a machine learning and AI background and was working on lots of things in the area of trying to make health data usable, kind of the N=1 type work to let people get access to their data and think about kind of an analytic approach to making like wellness a forefront rather than just taking care of someone who's sick. So just to set a little of the stage, a few years ago, I started thinking about data projects. And O'Reilly runs a really great event called Health Foo. Foo stands for Friends of O'Reilly, for those who don't know. And it's a agendaless conference to talk about a subject. And we had great people there, and I come from this analytic background, and started thinking about why there isn't more kind of good longitudinal study, and what are the things that are in the way of getting work done. I started learning about HIPAA. I started learning about how clinical trials work and so forth. I started thinking, yes, there must be some way to bring the data together the same way that we see in some of the big social media companies and other people who are compiling a lot of data and finding things out because they have large populations that they can derive stuff from, but can also drill down to pretty detail to also learn other things. And that health may lend itself in particular to that. We thought about maybe ways of having data donated and getting around some of the privacy stuff with people like kind of volunteering. And this is where the Healthy Heart stuff comes in, projects like that. And we were able to put together a grant proposal and put a project together. We were kind of lucky enough in that Ian had done some work that was really relevant to bringing data from different places together. We also wanted to get patient-generated data in the loop. And this is things like Fitbits and heart monitors and all the things that are now on a phone that can work with health, and start bringing that in so that you get a lot of contextualizing, stuff that wasn't available in the past to make health data work. So that's kind of like the background where we came from. But for the project itself, I thought I'd turn to Rob, who was the project manager for all this, and pull this all together. And
yeah, so there's a lot that we don't understand about a lot of important diseases. And so also the way we treat these diseases is pretty random and sort of hit and miss. So there's just a lot of waste in the medical sort of field. And that's given rise to this kind of phenomenon or term called individualized or precision medicine. And the idea there is, don't put someone in a category and treat them accordingly. Understand the individual, potentially down to the genetic level, and treat them with more of a rifle shot than a shotgun. And to get to this whole vision of precision medicine, you need to understand diseases. You need to understand cancer and cardiovascular. And the workhorse for doing that is the clinical study or clinical research, clinical trials. And the problem there is that it's methodical and it's precise, but it's really slow. It's measured in years, sometimes decades. It's expensive, sometimes budgets of millions of dollars. And it's inefficient. A lot of the data that goes into publishing the results is not shared between study teams. So there is this new class of clinical study, something called a MOOCT, M-O-O-C-T, which is Massive Open Online Clinical Trial or Clinical Study. And so now you go from local research team, local hospital, recruiting local participants, to anybody anywhere in the world with an internet connection can participate and donate their data towards fighting some disease and making the world a better place. And so now you go from maybe having a 300-person cohort to having 10,000 or 100,000 or 1 million at a fraction of the cost of what it costs in classic clinical studies. And you go from a situation where you're measuring once a week or once a month to continuously, potentially minute to minute or even heartbeat to heartbeat. And you can do that ambiently using phones and sensors. So the problem is that there's a lot of potential with these online clinical studies, but there's also a lot of missing parts. And so there's research teams all over the place trying to put these things together, but there's no off-the-shelf sort of solutions to make them work. And so that's where O'Reilly and Robert Wood Johnson came in and pulled this study together. Basically what you said is to put health data to work in a hospital environment to kind of feed clinical research. And now that's moving over to the health data exploration project that Kevin Patrick runs at Cal IT2 in San Diego. But the idea was, let's find an existing MOOCT. Let's find an existing study and bring in some Uber geeks and identify problems and basically smooth out workflows. And the project itself, it wasn't all about disease. It was also about wellness and people living richer lives as well.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's what I mentioned in the intro, that we were going to bring in this kind of patient-generated data and the kind of things that track things about your environment. And my sense is that more and more that's going to be there, and that platforms like what we're going to describe that can bring all this stuff together so that you can correlate and look at what's going on will be increasingly important. So
I think there's an important vision that we had very early on where we're really bringing three worlds together that don't normally intersect. There's the clinical research world, which generally only lightly interacts with clinical care, right? How care is actually delivered in a hospital or clinic setting. And then the patient experience, which is usually divorced and happens at home, but increasingly happens online. And so what we're seeing is the collision of these three worlds, where what the patients do affects clinical care, which is part of research. So a lot of the work I've been doing, complementary to this project, has been working with quality improvement networks, where they're trying to create governance systems, data collection systems, care delivery systems, and research systems that all kind of harness all three constituents together. And I think it was the idea of how do we enable that to happen at larger scale, and how does that affect different focus efforts in clinical care delivery and in clinical research, as well as what patients do on their own.
Great. What's interesting about that is you almost couldn't have picked a better kind of study than the Healthy Heart study to kind of illustrate what we're talking about, given context, all the different factors that we're trying to bring together into something that can likely really make a big difference. So, Tuhin, why don't you tell us a little about Healthy Heart?
Sure, yeah. So I'll try to frame the background for the study a little bit. At the time, I was at UCSF, and I was in a very unique role at the time. So this was about 2010, 2011, and digital health, as we know it now, was skyrocketing. There was tons of startups and ideas and technologies that were coming in to the hospital to try to figure out what their place was in clinical care. And it was great. I interacted with a number of folks with fantastic ideas. At the same time, clinicians on campus, clinical scientists, researchers, were also coming up with their own ideas, what they wanted. I want an app to do this. I want, an iPad to sit here and talk to the patient and tell them what to do when they come into the clinic, and other things. And what I noticed was there was a huge gap between what clinicians, clinical scientists, and researchers ultimately wanted to do with technology and what technologists and entrepreneurs and the market was bringing into the hospital with this very new platform, which is the smartphone and wearables and things. And I met somebody on campus, Jeff Olgan, the head of cardiology, and he came to me and he said, look, I don't want to come up with the technology. I don't want to, inform technology. What I'd much rather do is take all of it that is happening, figure out a way to integrate it into a clinical research project, validate what's actually powerful for clinical medicine, and then figure out a way to deploy it. And he said, I want to do that in cardiology, and I want to, I think we ought to build this thing called the eHeart study. And he had me. I mean, I was like, that's the best way to actually bridge this divide. And so we started working in earnest on eHeart. The whole idea was to solve 4 problems at the time in clinical research. 1, the cost. So I'm just going to echo what Rob said. At the time, a clinical research project could cost on the order of $40,000 per participant. So we're talking a multi-site study that's traditional in clinical research. That's got to stop. And the curve there was continuously going up, and I think it still is, but the whole goal behind our approach was to bend the cost curve down in terms of participation. The second problem was that a lot of times the clinical studies would redevelop the cohort. So you get a whole bunch of people, you characterize them, and then somebody else who wanted to do something similar, for example in cardiovascular disease, would have to rebuild another cohort with a lot of the same data elements. So, how do we pull together the efforts there and try to build a well-characterized cohort that can be reused and recycled?
So does that address the kind of longitudinal nature of data, that you get more from a longitudinal study over a long time as opposed to re-signing everyone up?
Sure. I think that's part of the problem, but fundamentally it's a much easier problem that should be solved, which is you enroll somebody, you just have to get some basic information on them, and that was happening over and over and over and over again. It happens in the healthcare system in general, but in clinical research it's pretty pervasive also. And so we just wanted to build a platform that had a lot of participants that were well characterized, that you could then deploy a randomized controlled trial very easily. So that was the third aim. So if we can get all these folks together, then we could do rapid clinical science, because we already have a well-characterized population. We can inject a random intervention amongst the population and test for effects. And then the fourth arm was really focused on what the market was doing, which was coming up with things like Fitbits and the AliveCore ECG on the back of the phone, and tremendous innovations based on the smartphone platform, the tablet form factor, and finding a way for those folks to interact with the clinical research process in a very easy way. And so eHeart, while it's focused on cardiovascular disease science, and the ultimate goal is to improve the understanding of cardiovascular disease, and just to put a little more context around that, to date, our understanding of cardiovascular disease is governed by this Framingham study, which is a cohort in Framingham, Massachusetts, that's been followed for about 60 years. It's a tremendous project, but because of resources and technology, it's been focused in a localized area with a small group of folks. So eHeart's really trying to expand that to a global population and do it in a way that's reusable, recyclable, and rapid in terms of clinical research. So that's really the approach we took. And I think Rob and Ian have touched on some of the complementary things that fall into that, which is a patient-centered medical home and what's happening in the home and how that informs clinical care decisions, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, so you've got pretty ambitious goals for how many people to participate.
Yes. So, the goal is to get over 1 million people into the study. We're well on our way. I think in about 2 years we've got 30,000, and I don't know that the marketing effort in the study has really ramped up. So this is organic growth largely, which is great. We had some good articles that came out early on, and we've kind of used that organic growth to pull in more and more people. And the feedback we're hearing is that folks really like participating in the study, which is great.
That's really good, and it kind of brings up, clearly this data is being captured in the clinical setting. But there's so much more that we can capture. Maybe both of you can talk a little about how bringing in people, the kind of data that people generate themselves into this can really augment that kind of information.
So when we started Healthy Heart, there was a lot of talk about, if everybody just wore a Fitbit, then we'd all be healthier, right? If we all just walked 10,000 steps, we'd all be, Ironman. And I think on some level you can believe that. There's like a line of reasoning you can go down and you can get there. However, in clinical research and clinical science, you do need the evidence to prove that out. And so the perspective that we took in Healthy Heart is we are outright skeptical of a lot of these digital health technologies. We are skeptical of what a patient may do or wear or measure at home and how that will ultimately influence the care delivered and the outcome of that patient in terms of their health and disease. That said, we are ambitious and we'd like to incorporate that data and look at it in the context of real hard outcomes in the clinic and figure out, okay, does this really move the needle in terms of making people feel better and do better? So that's the perspective we had, and I'm going to stop there because I think Ian's going to fold in.
Right. I just want to say I admire your Popperian, if that's how you say it, Karl Popper perspective on this, and that really you're saying that you're going to be skeptical. You really need good evidence that any of this is going to work, which I think is exactly what a research platform can help provide. Sure. Is that you can, really you're saying there's a null hypothesis that does this work or not?
Right, and we should come back to kind of the types of science that are possible now with something like Healthy Heart and MOOCs in general, which is the divorce between data-driven science and hypothesis-driven science. But I'll let Ian kind of chime in on the work at Cincinnati because that's great in terms of outcomes.
Yeah, I think one of the inspiring pieces of precursor work was taking place in chronic care management in pediatric networks. So earlier I mentioned the Quality Improvement Network. And as a backdrop, I think it's important to understand how they've been using kind of online, non-clinical research science to improve the quality of outcomes. So the way that the network works is you connect a whole bunch of different clinics, you get them to measure the same data in the same way, and you look at the key outcomes for a disease, and then you say who's outperforming and who's underperforming, and why. So you systematically test a hypothesis in another center. So you say, well, I think we can improve outcomes by having this change in practice. So we're going to meet with patients 3 times a year or 4 times a year instead of 2. And immediately you see a bump in the outcomes over, say, 4 or 5 months. After you've replicated that case, you can then say everybody in the network, all 100 hospitals are now going to do this. And all of a sudden, thousands of kids are healthier. So what they're trying to do is solve the last mile problem in healthcare, which is, well, a lot of the action in chronic disease happens at home. So what's going on at home? Well, the only way a doctor or a nurse knows what's going on at home is they have to ask the patient, over the last 3 to 6 months, how has your child's health been? So there's a lot of survey instruments built around this retrospective 1, 3, 6 month interval. The problem is we don't remember what we had for breakfast 3 days ago. So there's a huge noise involved in trying to peer through all of that data. So one of the projects I worked on with Cincinnati was just trying to bring that context from home into the clinical care episode. So it starts out with as the patient's getting ready for a visit, they'll come into their first visit, and we ask them, well, what are your primary health concerns? So maybe that child's having a particular symptom that they're trying to manage, or the parent's concerned about the frequency of coughing. So they'll provision an app that the parent or the child or both can take home to just document their experience and sort of paint a picture of what's really going on at home. And this longitudinal body of data now starts flowing into the system we created that's connected back into the Cincinnati Children's environment. And then when they come back in for the next visit, there's this whole picture of what happened over the last 3 months. Now, what we've been finding over the last few years, all the things you can do with that information. So the first one is it's too much information. All that data by itself it's an overload for a system that's already overloaded. So some of the key things you have to think about are, what are the inferences I want to make from that data? So if it's a child that's having a problem, she's getting up too many times at night because of some of her symptoms, and she's just trying to sleep more. So you could say, well, I have an outcome variable. I'm trying to improve this patient's particular experience. And there's a set of things that the physician can try. So even between the visit, with a little bit of messaging, you can say, well, try taking this over-the-counter medication. Well, we've seen no change. OK, so after 2 weeks, we're done. Now, normally, that kind of exchange would happen over quarters and 6-month visits, not in a matter of weeks. But understanding when outcomes have changed requires somebody to watch the data. So what we've been developing are algorithms that can look at the data and make sort of simple assurances. This data is pretty much the same as the earlier data, so we don't need to take any action. So as you start to build up a little bit of algorithms, the algorithms help the people optimize their workflow. So for the last 3 years, we've been co-developing both algorithms, processes, communication patterns to integrate this data into clinical care. And that obviously touches on the EMR, where you have for regulatory purpose to record all the data. So how do you record the data? How do you act on the data? How do you pull the data from the EMR and present it to the patient? How do you take the patient's data back into the EMR? All these problems sort of have been at the heart of the improvements that we've made. And that was a lot of what, in our early discussions, led to thinking about this project, of doing that deep dive, of really getting into a particular workflow and trying to understand how to make it better. All this stuff comes out of the woodwork that you wouldn't have expected coming in from an engineering perspective or a non-healthcare professional's perspective.
Right. So I think in terms of looking at it cohesively, the whole project, it's great because you can think of Healthy Heart as being the front end. So you have new technologies, new data, you have new clinical questions, clinical science questions. All of that gets chewed on, and an intervention or a result comes out, new knowledge comes out. How does that new knowledge get then integrated into a care delivery system that's actually capable of executing it well? And so end to end, there's just a tremendous amount of nuance. And this project looked at all of the details where we could in the nuances in that approach. So, yeah.
One of the things I'd like you to go a little further into, Ian, is the notion of variable. I know variable is the right word, but that baselines are not really consistent. And this is something I know that you've talked a lot about with us on the project.
Yeah, when you're dealing with data from patients, one of the things we try to do as scientists is we actually try to get rid of noise, right? We try to isolate, we try to control. And when you're dealing with an ecological environment like the home, there's all sorts of variability. And so the context. So early on, we had this wonderful case where one of our third or fourth patient all of a sudden has a spike in one of their symptoms. And the clinical research coordinator looking at the data, oh my gosh, there's an adverse event, which in clinical research has to be reported. There's a whole bunch of process around it. So she picked up the phone and called the patient's family, and it's like, oh, she's having a sinus infection. Right, so totally ordinary thing, but on the graph it was very scary. It triggered a false positive. So when you think about the context of that, you could say, well, this is a horrible health outcome, or it's an ordinary blip in the life of a patient. And how do you differentiate between the two? So when you're trying to understand a baseline, one question is, what are all of the factors that are going to bear on, say, the number of times I wake up at night? Well, I might be stressed out. I might be sick. There's any number of things that can happen. Now, on the average day, I sleep pretty well for the most part. But if I had a health condition, maybe I'm getting up 2 times a night on average. Sometimes I get up once. Sometimes I don't get up at all. Sometimes I'm on vacation. And so all of these variations are very easy to create false positive, which creates burden on the healthcare system. So the idea of a baseline is valuable because you say, given what I know about what's likely to happen, over a period of time, I can measure and get a pretty good sense of the dynamics of a particular variable that I'm interested in. And so you have to think very carefully when you're trying to look at home as you're comparing a baseline ordinary sinus infections and sleepless nights and vacations against the testing condition where, okay, we're going to make a change in your life or in your environment, and we want to watch that over time and see if it varies from your baseline.
Mm-hmm. Great. So maybe you guys can describe a little bit the components of the project itself. We're trying to marry these different pieces together. Maybe we can just have like this, a quick kind of architecture of what we produced.
When we started the project and we sat down with the Healthy Heart team, we did a couple of deep dives, just understanding their problem, what's going on. It's a kind of a typical requirements analysis that you might go through. And the key theme that kept emerging was collaboration. That clinical research teams have a particular set of expertise, but there's often, for something like a MOOC, you need a much larger diversity of expertise. And that can be hard for economic reasons and just environment. You're in a hospital, there's a certain set of skills that are available. So you have some fantastic researchers, some great engineers helping build out the technology. But you need to collaborate. You need to collaborate with people building devices. You need to collaborate with patients. You need to collaborate with statistics experts that have experience that you don't have. And so the projects that we decided to do deep dives on all came out of this theme of trying to understand what extra sources of expertise would be valuable to the team and how would we facilitate that expertise. And the three projects came out of this. One was understanding the analysis of longitudinal data. It's not common in clinical research to be looking at lots of repeated measures over a long period of time. And so we wanted to do a deep dive on analyzing the data. How would we roll that up into the clinical study? At the same time, we realized there's statisticians who have expertise that we'd like to bring in, but they're not local. And so, ironically, they could come in, plug their laptop in, pull the data on, and work on it, but they can't do it remotely, and you can't transfer the data to them because of some of the restrictions of the IRB and the other regulations governing that data. So we said, is there a way we can do a virtual on-site kind of equivalent and get that past the hospital's review board? And the last area was thinking about all of the data plumbing. So you've got a good team using existing, well-understood tools, but that aren't really designed for 1 million patients collecting data points every day for the next 10 years. And so the technologies that we're developing in the enterprise are suited to this, but they're not designed to deal with the sort of complexity of health data. So how would we reconcile those two worlds? And so we did a deep dive on that as well, trying to understand what would be the right interface. If we could imagine a commercial tool that the Healthy Heart team could have used, what would that look like?
You know, just because we came up with a clever name, I believe maybe it was Tuhin who came up with this, but the kind of security regime is the trusted analytic container. And this was a way to allow the kind of collaboration and multi-purposing of the data that was really one of the goals of the project. So as part of the High-Tech Act, there's this concept of meaningful use as a way to show that these electronic medical record systems were being used. And what that did is put in some rules and guidelines on how the data could be shared. And that did create some opportunities to perhaps get data, particularly on the kind of donation perspective. So between IRB, HIPAA, and meaningful use, this was kind of like the ecosystem we were working in as we developed the project. Now I want to go into the kind of key learnings from the project. And one of the things I just want to emphasize is that this was a real learning experience. And from the start, that was part of the grant, was to, if you're trying to do some of this, what you can learn. So as you hear what's going on, what you're going to be hearing for the audience is that we went around a little bit and really did learn a lot. And I think that if you're paying attention, you'll find some great lessons for anyone who's thinking of going into the field. So why don't we start with Ian and what you decided to focus on early on in trying to create the kind of platform we were trying to describe.
Well, one of the first learnings was this collaboration problem of needing to work with other groups and being unable to do so because of some of the restrictions about how data could move around. And when we really dug into it, we found out it's not a big deal to have somebody come onto the hospital, plug into the network, work with data, and then to leave it behind and leave again. And so one of the big questions was, could we create a virtual version of visiting the hospital that would satisfy the institution that the appropriate protection, the data was still under their control, it's consistent with the IRB, didn't violate HIPAA. And so we created this concept called the trusted analytics container. And the idea is it's owned by the person who owns, or the entity that owns the data. So the hospital would own a virtual private network within a public cloud like Amazon or Google. And those machines would be provisioned with the protected data, and then particular credentials would be given out to the partner to come into that set of machines, and they could install their own software and do whatever they wanted, but they had to keep the data within this trusted analytics container. And so we set up a whole set of trust but verify infrastructure around it. So we would look at network traffic in and out. We would look at all the administrative actions that took place. And then when they were done doing their analysis, they might want to take some of that data home with them, sort of de-identified aggregated data or study results. So they would put that into a little virtual volume, shut down the container, and then somebody at the home institution could review the data and say, yes, this meets our standard for release. And so it was setting up a technology support for workflow that was familiar to people in the hospital. And then we would take that back, and we actually did take that back to the boards that are responsible for liability and compliance and so on to review this and say whether it was okay. And so as a sign of changing times, that was we were approved to do collaboration using this virtual container, which is now an open source project that we've put up on GitHub.
Yeah, one of the things I love about the TAC, as we've been calling it internally, is that it's so human-oriented. Right? It's not just a technology solution, but it acknowledges the way people work, tries to solve the problem, and keep everyone in their having the kind of relative rights and positions that we want. I mean, you mentioned the regulation sometimes is an obstacle, but there is a reason for them. I mean, if I'm in this study, I also want to be protected as well. And I think it's a pretty ingenious way of handling the problem by bringing so much into it.
Yeah, I think one thing that Ian forgot to highlight is the problem that industry partners have when dealing with clinical research projects, in that they may have secret sauce, especially technology companies that are trying to validate that their technology or core IP. They may have secret sauce that they want to munge with a clinical research program, but without exposing their stuff, right? And so the TAC also solves that problem, which is huge.
It creates a sort of a marketplace of research and analytics that wouldn't be available otherwise.
That's right. In Healthy Heart, we did not want to expose individualized data at all. I mean, it's just not going to happen. We did want to share aggregated results that were meaningful to the partners. And on the flip side, they didn't want to do the same, right?
And when we first started working on it, I was struggling to understand sort of a use case of why this was valuable. And the thing that really popped out to me is that you've got a lot of technologists with phone apps and sensors and everything, but they don't often get access to outcomes. And so anywhere where they can see what their little tool is doing and somehow correlate that with actual health outcomes is really valuable, and that's,
Well, John Wilbanks is fond of saying that any data that is de-identified to the point where your privacy is protected is pretty much unuseful from the standpoint of doing analysis. So in reality, there's a lot of I think there's some interesting technologies that might change that. But so far, in practice, you really need access to all the raw data to get meaningful learning from it. And it creates all these problems for de-identifiability. So being able to move the data into a trusted environment where I can bring my special sauce, if you will, and they can provide the data in a mostly identified form, we'll work on it in a restricted way. But then I can take away my learning, you can take away your learnings. I don't have to expose my IP to the company. It just really simplifies a lot of the transactional barriers to collaboration in these clinical research projects.
Yeah, and as an analyst myself, I know that there's a German word, Fingerspitzengefühl, which means fingertip feel, is that unless you can go through kind of the raw data and get some sense of it, sometimes it's hard. And I don't mean like looking at people's first names. That isn't the kind of thing I mean. But that getting at that kind of detailed level, looking at the histograms and frequency distributions and stuff makes a huge difference in what you're going to do next.
That's right.
In analytics, there's a lot of art involved.
Yeah, it's this whole idea of going from data-driven science to hypothesis-driven science. You have to have the discovery phase. You get a whole bunch of data, you put it together, and you have no idea what to expect, right? You have to go through the process of cleaning it up and noticing sinus infections and, and dealing with that. And then you finally get to a point you go, wow, this is actually kind of interesting. Now let's actually ask a question and do it rigorously and figure out if that question has a meaningful answer one way or another.
Going back to the idea of, the HIPAA has within it de-identification standards, something they call the safe harbor standard, where if you strip all of these 16 or 17 identifiers that they identified, then you can sort of share the data because you don't have access to the identity. But when you have enough longitudinal data, that creates a unique signature. So with the right external data sources, almost any health data can be re-identified. And there's increasingly researchers are showing given a dump of de-identified records from like MGH, they were able to identify the mayor's record or the governor's record in Massachusetts. So there's so part of what you want to do is you want to preserve confidentiality. So I don't need to know who the patient's name is, but I do need to know date of birth, their age, their demographics. Like that's really useful medical data, just not your name. So you can remove a few of those identifiers. When you get rid of all the HIPAA identifiers, not only have you not solved de-identifiability, but you've made the data less useful. So rather than trying to game the system by trying to figure out what identifiers you can remove, it's better to say, look, we really need the identified data with as minimal confidentiality preserving transformations as possible to get the most value for everybody. And so we just need to be responsible about how we move that semi-re-identifiable data around.
Right. Now I think we're in an exploration. I mean, this is what can make some real changes, is being able to explore data. And you guys have created the kind of platform that allows that, which brings up a specific kind of data that is kind of hard to look at, and that's time series data. So, Tuhin, maybe you can talk a little about some of the problems with it. And I'll just quickly say a time series is just over time, over some regular interval of time, you've got a reading, and you're trying to make sense of it. And it sounds trivial. It definitely is not, because it's complicated in a way. You've got to turn it into something that's useful.
Yeah, so again, I'll put my lens on this. So coming from image analysis and machine vision, that area, time series data analysis is kind of second nature. And so when we got into this project, we started talking about the difficulties. And there are lots of difficulties, and it is very much a field that has a lot of depth to it. But taking a step back, I think what is unique about how Healthy Heart is having to deal with time series data is when I was doing my postdoc work, I just bought, a $10,000 computer and put the entire image into memory and chewed on, the time series voxels and got an answer, right? And if I couldn't do that, then that analysis wasn't happening, right? And so now what's happened is, and right around that time, incidentally, was when the big table paper came out and the MapReduce paper came out, and I read those two papers and I was like, wow, these guys at Google have kind of solved a very fundamental problem in image analysis. But you come 10, 15 years forward and we're still, on some level, struggling with time series analysis at huge scale. And so I think the issues are still the same. You have time series data that needs to get cleaned up, that needs to be processed for quality, and then it needs to get munged together with other signals to figure out actual correlations and relationships with other samples, right? But the resolution has gotten a lot higher, right? The phone is on constantly. It's constantly collecting step measurements and calorie burn, it's just crazy. And then the number of things that are measuring, right? When I was doing imaging science, you had one MRI machine. Now everybody's, there's 400 million machines collecting data sets. So the scale of the problem has grown tremendously. And so single sample analysis, just doing regressions against, does X match with Y, is much harder when you're looking at X as a function of time. And so I don't know that we really have good answers for that yet. I know there's a lot of people working on that, and there's a lot of fields that have come together to work on that. But time series analysis for something like Healthy Heart or for a MOOC that is collecting dense data, trying to match it up against outcomes data, is a still, I think, unsolved problem.
Yeah, I mean, so I think you raised two interesting issues, right? There's time series in the small. I have a longitudinal record of my steps, and so I could talk a little bit about how we've been using things like that in the clinic. So we have a set of patients in cystic fibrosis that have a seasonal disorder, and a lot of time series techniques were built for climate data, right? Thinking about climate models, and so you're looking for periodicities in the data. Health data is a lot noisier than that. We can also talk a lot about how do you handle impairments, like missing data points. So patients forget to answer data for a few days. And so do you smooth over it? Do you ignore it? Well, it depends on the inference you're making, right? And so the judgments about how to handle all the impairments in real-world data are kind of still an art. And
then Roger talks about, we had that discussion about, do you use the entire stream of data, or do you develop an ontology and sort of
do you chunk it?
Right?
Chunk it. Do you do episodes? Is there other data you need to bring in to look at it, which is, in the case of an N of 1, I can talk a little bit about an N of 1 trial. So one of the ways we deal with longitudinal data. And then I think there's the big data problem, where you can take a data summary and you can say, well, what is people's average step count, right, over the population? And wow, people who smoke have less steps. So there's kind of the aggregate view of lots of time series data where you decimate it down to a number, which is more familiar to classic data analysis.
Ian, as you were saying that, I'm reminded of thinking about heart rate data, where you've got this big stream of data, and your heart is in these various states. But what you might want to chunk or bin it into is times of activity, how many times you're active in a day, and the nature of that action, because there's lots of things that can raise your heart rate.
Right.
Being scared, exercising, other activities. And if you can identify those some way, that's an example of where you're taking a big time series and turn it into something that's more usable in terms of figuring out what actions and what things correlate with better outcomes or worse outcomes and so forth. So we talked some about the TAC as creating this platform. Now we want to talk about what we're going to do with it. And one of the issues is around getting a lot of this longitudinal time series data. And there's some challenges with that. And Ian, maybe you can start with some examples, and Tuhin, you can kind of finish up with some general learnings from working with this kind of data.
Yeah, I think it helps to understand a concrete example. So in clinical care today, when you're managing hypertension, for example, in cardiology patients, that management is driven by a single measurement that's taken during your clinical visit, your blood pressure. So we have wonderful instruments that take very precise measures of your current blood pressure. But what they don't capture is the fact your blood pressure is always moving around. So there's this and we often see this in healthcare, there's an artificial sense of precision is really important. But if precision can't capture the full dynamism of the underlying physiological process we're measuring, then we're missing something. So increasingly, we're seeing literature where home blood pressure measurements, which are less precise, but you can get more frequent and are more representative. So another source of noise, not just my normal variation, but in the clinic, I might be anxious. That causes a rise in blood pressure, and so it's called white coat hypertension. So I get this very precise, inaccurate measure. So precision and accuracy are surprisingly different things. So longitudinal analysis, one thing you can do with longitudinal data is just roll it all up. So if I take a bunch of measures at home, I get high measures and low measures. But over time, over all my circumstances of life, I get a pretty good picture of what is my actual blood pressure at home. And that is what we're interested in, because it's the beating of that pressure against my organs that causes stroke and heart failure and all sorts of other problems related to hypertension. So when we think about longitudinal data analysis, we want to take a large series of data. Fitbit data is another example, where you can just come up with a descriptive statistic and say, well, every quarter, here's been my average blood pressure this quarter. I'm going to change my hypertension medication, and I'm going to go home and do a bunch of measurements again, and my blood pressure is going to go down. So you can think about that 3-month interval where I measured my blood pressure as a single number, a feature. But there's a process of taking the raw data and turning it into something I can act on and make decisions about.
Yeah, so fundamentally, that's what we're trying to do with this kind of analytics.
Yeah, and so I think the real challenge is that while there's a tremendous amount of expertise in terms of looking at these clinical features and elucidating healthcare outcomes from them, getting down to features from dense data is very much an art. And there's a number of ways to do it. There are descriptive statistics, there are machine learning, deep learning, you have clustering analysis techniques. And so the real challenge is you have clinical scientists that may know what they want to look for. You have data scientists that know how to munch the data and get things out of it, but don't know what they're looking for. And how do you pair them up and put them in a space where they can operate together and actually find new knowledge? And so I think that's what ultimately we're trying to do inside the tech, right?
Yeah, I think that by bringing this up, we've actually presented ourselves with even facing this problem, where something that was harder to even work with before. So I think that's one of the real values of the platform. It's not as easy a leap as doing app A and moving to app B to move into health. And I think one of the key learnings from our project is the kind of things that someone who might be wanting to think about this change, what they would want to do. So you guys can talk a little about how health is different and what things people might want to keep in mind.
Yeah, I think that one is, when I was in academia early in my career, we had what we called the kernel problem. So and we write an academic paper about how we could speed up computation by an order of magnitude with this fancy architecture. And when I took that out and I built a company around it, we realized that's about the first 10% of the problem. The rest of the 90% doesn't require as much creativity, but it all has to be done right. And so I think it's important to realize at the outset that the problem is an order of magnitude bigger than you think it is. And if you haven't gone into healthcare before, that's hard to internalize. Secondly, don't be afraid of the regulations. Just be aware of them and embrace them. Don't try to avoid them. Because eventually the regulators will figure out you're avoiding them. And if you are putting patients at risk in any conceivable way, they're going to come after you anyway. So let's go ahead and embrace the system as it is. The third learning, and we wrote about this recently, is that when you're thinking about commercial avenues, you need to fit into an existing business model. Healthcare is very complicated also from a payment and an economic standpoint. And so when you're crafting a business or a product or an innovation, I've seen tons of wonderful, useful tools that just cannot get funded because there's no current revenue stream that distribution model can tap into. So people often talk about horizontal scalability. So you build like Slack as this wonderful group communications tool, and they went and they had 70,000 customers in 6 months or 12 months. And in healthcare, there's if I build a solution for one hospital, chances are the next one's going to need something a little bit different and a little bit different. So that makes for very slow dissemination. Sales cycles are 18 months. They can't make decisions. They need evidence. So it's you crafting your economic trajectory is probably more important than the strength of your technology innovation. because it's so hard to move the systems. You can't just build it and they will pay for it, which is kind of how it is in enterprise. And it's certainly how it is in consumer, if you've hit the right buttons. But in healthcare, you can hit all the right buttons and still not get paid. And so I think that's another thing it's important to internalize. And it's easy to fool yourself if you haven't done it before. You just don't understand how hard it is. But that said, at the end of the day, you get to go home at night. And I'll share one story of the other side. It's hard and it's challenging. I had a call from a very early academic prototype when I was doing a mid-career PhD. And she had asked to use my system. And she shows up in the ER with a kid who has cystic fibrosis. He's been coughing worse and worse, and she's concerned he might have an exacerbation, which means his lungs filling up with bacteria. And if you let that go, he'll die. So the doctor says, we cannot take a risk. Your vacation is over, 3 weeks in the bed, antibiotics, and it's going to be an IV drip. And she said, well, the thing is, I've seen exacerbations before, and in an exacerbation, you're coughing all the time. But he's better at the day, and he's running around, and then he's bad at night. So I just think he's got postnasal drip. The doctor said, yeah, but you can't take a risk. And this was a doctor in ER, didn't know her, didn't know how to treat her data. And so she pulls up this site and says, look, this is what an exacerbation looks like, and this is what it looks like now. And after some back and forth, he says, OK, I'll tell you what. We'll agree to a 24-hour hold, and we'll give him nasal steroids. If he's not better in the morning, we'll put him on IV. And if he's better, he can go home. And he was discharged the next morning, and they went back to their vacation. And so I think at the heart of everything we're trying to do here is it's about creating trust, is that patients have data, clinicians have data, and everything we do in trying to create evidence is trying to help people have confidence in the decisions they make. And I think in health, we struggle to create this kind of physics-like purity of data and statistics and process. And it is just messier than anybody wants to admit. And so the human component, the physicians, the patients, all play a much more important role in operationalizing the data that we can now collect than I think is immediately obvious.
Great. Some of this is captured, too, in the paper Ian alluded to, that there'll be a link on the site that you can click it. And it covers what we call the 6 C's. They're complexity, which Tuhin covered, computing, context, culture, contracts, and commerce. So if you want to read more about this in a little more detail in terms of moving forward. So I want to thank everyone for participating in this discussion. Hopefully you've gained some perspective on how data can realistically impact the health care system, can lead to better outcomes, can help with cost containment and lifestyle management. So hopefully you've gotten something out of this, and I'm sure this discussion has generated some questions, and now's the time we can take those online.
All right. Thanks so much, everyone. We are at the Q&A portion of the event now, and we'll give our panels folks a chance to get back on the line, and we'll take some of those great questions. Folks, again, if you joined us a little bit late, if you have a question about what you've been watching and hearing on the screen today, open your group chat widget, type it in, send it in, and we'll take as many as we have time for. Roger, back to you.
Great. So we've gotten some questions in, and I thought we would just start with a question that just came in around. I'll just read the question. When you look at the landscape of health devices and apps, what are the most exciting trends that might have an impact on patient care? What are patients most excited about sharing? I'll just start. Sorry, I have a dog here. Dog-friendly workplace. We don't have we only have anecdotal information about this. It's not like we have surveys of what's going on or have talked to everyone involved in health. I'll just say that from my perspective, what's really interesting is that we've gone beyond the device kind of a standalone into things like what we discussed this morning, where the actual good research and thinking about research in a different way can happen. So I don't know if anyone else wants to pitch in about this.
Well, I'd say that in the work that I've been doing in chronic disease, I think that the exciting trend in my mind is not the devices and the data, it's the social processes that are evolving. It's the example that I shared there at the end about a woman who was able to take device data in, not so much to drive diagnosis or treatment per se, but to underscore and provide context for her verbal self-report. And I think it's actually a good segue into another question we had, which was, really what kind of error? How do we understand the veracity of the data that we're getting from patients? And it's a really interesting question, and I think there's two dimensions that it's good to think about when thinking about the kind of data that patients are providing. There's a dimension of what is the purpose of this data. So on the one end, we have the kind of data we collect in the clinic, which is vital signs, laboratory results, blood tests. These are things that are taken rarely. They need to be very precise because they're either the basis for, they were the input for clinical trials. So we know that given these numbers, if we take this treatment, an average patient's going to do better. But on the other end, there is behavioral data. So if you think about an interview, you have 15 minutes with a patient, and their retrospective recall of the last 3, 6, or 12 months is going to drive all the additional context that helps that provider make a decision. And if that provider and patient don't have a great communication discord, the provider's not great at doing interviews, the quality of that clinical decision is much lower. And so I think the most exciting thing I've seen is the ability to take tracking data into the clinic and actually use it to improve the doctor-patient discourse so there's much more accurate context around the behavioral equation in health. And if half the people in the country have a behaviorally driven chronic disease, so it's not a secondary factor, it's actually primary. Obviously there's noise, but it's actually, I think the data has less noise in it than our verbal self-report. So the other dimension then has to do with precision. So if you're taking data like blood pressure, which will be used to drive treatment, home blood pressure, despite its imprecision on a point-by-point basis, in aggregate has more utility for diagnostic, so for treatment decisions than that one measure you get in the clinic. And I'm going to stop here because I don't want to take up too much airtime.
Well, you think you're going in a pretty interesting direction. I was just about to paste a link to the article. Someone had asked for that, so I'm going to do this right now. So if you're on the group chat, you'll see a way to get to the article. Okay, and I'm just going through. There's a question. So we had a question from Kevin Patrick about if anyone has used the TAC yet, since we've open sourced it on GitHub. And Dennis, I don't know if anyone has used it. Ian or Tuhin?
Yeah, my answer to Kevin was that we have a few followers, but I haven't received reports of field uses outside of our pilot at UCSF, where UCSF okayed our use of that tool to help the Healthy Heart team work with an external vendor. So, there's evidence that it works, but I think there's a lot of work to be done there. Just to provide some additional context, we started some early discussions with Sage Bionetworks that have two platforms that are actually really relevant, and I think ideally we'd like to have them take over the work we've done on the TAC. So they have a project called Bridge and another project called Synapse, which are kind of open. So so Sage Bionetworks is a nonprofit spin out of Merck, I think. And Bridge is a way of helping people build out clinical trials using mHealth data. They were heavily involved in ResearchKit at Apple. John Wilbanks, who I mentioned earlier in the video, is a part of that project. And Synapse is about kind of managing your technology pipelines and collaborating around data. And they run all their systems in the cloud. So having something like the TAC to augment what they're doing there, I think would be an incredibly powerful addition to their toolkit. And it'd be a great home for the project kind of post the research phase of our project.
Okay, great. Dennis Allen asked, he said it looks like he's working on wearable devices, and can wearable devices trigger patient engagement? And mentions that the stage 3 of the EMR, EHR rules are trying to increase patient engagement. Again, it's anecdotal, but I would say that when people do get a device, there is a temporal increase in engagement. It often, anecdotally, tends to slip when there isn't like a change happening if the person is like margin gains. Like an athlete who has OCD might be very engaged for a very long time, but someone who's maybe trying to increase their walking and get the Fitbit, it seems to me like it does. People do check for the first while, and will talk about what's going on. I think making that sustained is going to be more difficult. And so I actually am curious if any of the others have any comments on that.
Yeah, so I think wearables have this tremendous engagement phenomena that you just highlighted, Roger, where you get the Fitbit or you get an app and you start tracking. You're really, really in tune with that whole process. And after time, it has been noticed that there's a fall off in the engagement. And I actually think what's interesting with meaningful use and the interoperability of data and where healthcare information is headed is the real solution is to take these wearables, which I think have intrinsic value, tremendous value for the healthcare system, and coupling that with somebody listening on the other end of the line. I think right now you can look at a lot of the wearables and devices as one-way telephones. And what patients really want is they want somebody listening on the other side. And so as soon as we're able to connect them meaningfully to the EMR and to the physician's workflow, I think, I think there is a real chance that wearables and apps can bring about meaningful change to healthcare outcomes. I'll end with a question, which is, I think there is much more to do than just pull in step count data, calorie data, daily blood pressure measures into an EMR for a physician to look at. That's not going to solve any problems because most physicians are already overwhelmed. And so what we need to think about, what we need to be asking ourselves is, we have all of this data. It's tremendous. There is potential value in it. How do we look at it and present it and deliver it into the healthcare workflow such that it does feel like the patient is having a conversation and a dialogue with their clinician and making progress towards becoming better in their health and disease?
Yeah, I want to add one more thing to that, and this is from other work that I know is going on, is I think there's going to be a lot around kind of a behavioral economics approach to getting people to engage in their health. And that, I mean, if I were to forecast out, I think in the future there will be some type of monitoring that actually may not inform them on a regular basis, but will actually note when something has changed. If there's weight gain, there's activity drop, there's something that's happened that is worth at least letting you know, or health provider engaging with you to either make a change or ask what might be going on that caused that change. And I've seen a few apps that go beyond just the device monitoring, but it's trying to engage. I'd say at this point they're pretty early, and we really have a lot to learn about human behavior. Now, we're really kind of at the end. We've gotten a couple of there's one more, and then that will be our last one about IRB. Let me find that. Sorry.
Go ahead.
So I think this comes from Camille Neberger. What have been the biggest challenges to getting IRB approval? I don't know. I think, Ian, you were the one who covered IRB.
Generally speaking, I think we haven't had a lot of challenges with IRB because most of this data is minimal risk. And we're not changing care. We're not intervening in the physical health of a person directly. So, the difficult parts are writing an IRB that gives you sufficient flexibility. And that varies a lot from IRB to IRB. So I've had the same study, passed easily at one IRB and the other one take 3 months of back and forth. Also within an IRB, the individual you end up working with is also very important. You'll find somebody who's just very pedantic and hasn't done a study like these mHealth studies before. But I think generally, it's they want to understand that the data is going through a well-defined process. They want to understand, really what the risks are, what happens with the data after the study. They know all the typical things that come up with the IRB. But I think the best analogy that we've used is that the data that we're collecting from these devices, to the extent they're not replacing a vital sign or a laboratory measure, I think that's a different class of study. The analogy is that it's like a survey, and survey research in mental health and in other conditions is well understood from an IRB perspective. So I think that gives you a good frame for going into an IRB with an mHealth study.
That's great. Well, we are at the end of the hour. I want to thank the audience for listening. I hope you appreciate just what kind of really great insights the panelists on the webinar brought to this project. They're, it was just a joy to work with everyone, and they all knew so much, were able to bring so much knowledge to, I've learned a ton from working with them. And just want to thank everyone involved, and get involved with health. It's not only maybe a good business, but it actually might help the world. So thanks, everyone.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.